Well, good evening. Good evening. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Jordan Baller, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the 2022 Kuyper Conference. I have the honor of serving as the Kuyper Conference coordinator. Again, I want to thank you all for coming. It's the first time we've been able to hold this conference in person in a couple of years, so we're very grateful that we're able to do that, and all of you are able here to join us here. Thanks especially to the sponsors who've made this event possible. Of course, we need the participants and attendees and contributors to the various sessions. I'd like to thank our hosts, especially Presidents Maidenblick and Leroy of Calvin Theological Seminary and Calvin University, Margie Steiff, who many of you have met at the registration table. She was assisted by Anastasia Watson in putting together the program, Ellen Heckman and Micah Watson of the Henry Institute. We're blessed to be able to partner with the Henry Institute Symposium. And Matthew Lumberg, who's the director of the DeVries Institute, is also around. So in addition to thanking them, I want to thank the print staff and the AV people who are supporting all the work that we're able to do here tonight. There's one schedule announcement that I want to make. There's been some attrition, unfortunately, for family reasons. So concurrent paper session C3, as it is in your program, is not going to occur. So that's tomorrow afternoon. The short paper sessions, there will only be two, C1 and C2. And the chairs will update you as to the contents of those two panels, or those two sessions. Before we get to the plenary speaker this evening, there is an introduction that I want to make and another short announcement of someone. I do want to say one other thing. This is the first event that we've had. One of my roles outside of working on the Kuyper Conference has been working on the Kuyper Translation series, and I want to thank all of the exhibitors who are out there, Baker and Lichtenstock and the Acton Institute, as well as Lexham Press, who is the publisher of the Abraham Kuyper Translation series. And they've got these cards that you can fill out, and for a discounted price, I believe it's $400, which is a significant discount. They'll mail you, that's inclusive of shipping, the entire series. So that's a deal you might want to check out if you haven't already been collecting those volumes as they've come out over the years. As I said, there's a brief surprise, a happy surprise guest that I want to introduce. James Backey of the Barnabas Fund is going to come up and make an announcement. James.
It is my honor to be here tonight to make this announcement of a new fund called the Abraham Kuyper Christian Leadership Fund that will be announced tomorrow. This fund was established by a gift from Rimmer and Ruth DeVries. Now, if you don't know that name, they are the donors that were supporting this conference and the Kuyper prize that has been awarded for, I think, the last 10 years or so. They passed away in the last few years, and in their estate, they wanted to set up this leadership fund. The DeVries estate gifted several million dollars to this fund for several potential projects, including the continued translation and distribution of Kuyper's works, developing tools and resources that will expand Kuyperian scholarship and the application of a reformed world and life view, support hosting conferences like this in different locations, as well as other initiatives that will expand Kuyper's influence on Christian thought leadership around the world. We will be making grants twice a year. These grants will be administered by Barnabas Foundation. Now, just a little bit about Barnabas Foundation. Since 1976, we have been assisting generous Christians with the transfer of the wealth God has entrusted to them in ways that honor God, provide for their families, but also support ministries close to their heart. And the DeVries were one of those families we were able to help. The grants, like I said, would be made twice a year. The grant selection committee was handpicked by Rimmer prior to his death. And if any of you anybody knew Rimmer personally? Oh man, most of you do. Okay, so you've had these conversations with Rimmer. By the way, my weekly calls with Rimmer were after he was gone, I was amazed at how much I missed those weekly calls. Some of you missed those weekly calls as well. And while they were always rigorous, I found myself missing him. And I found myself appreciating the passion with which those calls came. So this committee was handpicked by him prior to his death, and includes several people that are on the program this week, including our host, Jordan Baller, Corey Wilson from Calvin Theological Seminary, Stephanie Summers from Center of Public Justice, Craig Bartholomew, noted author and professor, and then the founder of the International Network for Christian Higher Education, Shirley Rules. Tomorrow we will be issuing a press release to a number of institutions around the country about this fund, so you are the first to hear about it. And if you'd like more information, if you'd like to make a grant application, I have some information about the fund, what the criteria is, and how to set up to send in an application. I'll have that in the back of the room tonight. And if you'd like to discuss it, I will be here both today and tomorrow. So thank you for coming, and it's just an honor to be a part of this conference with you.
Yeah, so in many ways, and many different ways, we owe Rimmer and Ruth a great deal of thanks for making these kinds of gatherings possible, and who knows what great things in the future through his ongoing generosity. It's my pleasure to introduce Lucas Freire. He received his PhD in politics from the University of Exeter. He's a native of Brazil who has lived and worked in the United Kingdom, South Africa, the United States, as well as Brazil. His academic research can be found in the Journal of Church and State, the Journal of Markets and Morality, Philosophia Reformata, among others. One article I want to bring to your attention, Abraham Kuyper and Guillaume Gruen van Prinster as anti-rationalist liberals, appeared last year in the Journal of Church and State, and I recommend it to your study. Lucas currently lives in Baltimore area with his family. He's currently researching economics and diplomacy of the ancient Near East. He is a winner of the Acton Institute's 2018 Novak Award, and the Acton Institute's a co-sponsor of this session as well as of the hors d'oeuvres that we had earlier. So help me welcome Lucas Freire. Thank you.
So before I begin, I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Jordan Baller for the invitation to be a plenary speaker at this conference. I'd like to thank Calvin University and Seminary for their hospitality. My initial plan was to start with a joke. I'm often told that my jokes are scholastic or reductionist, so I'm going to pass. And I don't want to get slapped in the face as well. The title of the talk is How Ideas Travel and Change. And obviously, my plan is to address that with reference to the case of Neocalvinism. Though this is more like an invitation that I want to extend to you, particularly those whose writing and teaching careers are wide-ranging explorations of the Neo-Calvinist tradition. Here's what I mean. I don't want to lay out a framework for the analysis of traveling ideas, then operationalize it, and then offer my account of the history of Neo-Calvinism as a traveling idea to illustrate the framework. Maybe some of you can do that in the future. Instead, my main goal here is to share with you what I believe to be some of the key elements that such a framework would require if we were to go down this path. And secondarily, to encourage you to expand on these thoughts as you undertake your own research. By doing this, I hope I can play a constructive role in a conversation that I know from this morning has already started, if not formally and academically, at least informally and implicitly. So the main topic before us this evening is the development of Neo-Calvinism with a particular focus on how Christians around the world have transmitted, received, absorbed, and transformed it in novel contexts. if we want to understand the intellectual development of New Calvinism and its impact across different contexts, first, it will be helpful to use the framework of a story of a trip or a voyage or a travel adventure. And second, if we want to tell the story of how New Calvinism travels and changes, it will be productive to list some of the types of characters that play a role in that story. And third, if we want to interpret the dynamic growth of New Calvinism as it travels across different contexts with those different types of characters, it will be useful also to look at some of the main actions in the plot of this narrative, the main practices that add motion to the story. So in short, first we have the story itself in its outlines, then the types of characters, and finally some bits of the plot in the narrative. Now, there are some assumptions behind this way of framing the issue, and I cannot give you a full list, but I believe part of the task this evening is to list some things for you to decide on whether to take this framework any further, if, like me, you're also inclined to tackle the global reception of New Calvinism in your everyday reflection. Let me simply state one notion that permeates the entire talk, and it's very simple, but I still think it should be made clear from the beginning. And the notion is this, that ideas, traditions of thought, theories, whatever we may call them, these things, they don't travel from one context to another by themselves. They are generated, transmitted, absorbed, modified, tested, disapproved, etc. by people, both individually and in community. On the one hand, I'll be returning to this point over and over, and on the other hand, it's also not my intention to focus on any particular individuals or groups that have interacted with or within New Calvinism. Sure enough, I'll give examples and we'll hear much about specifics throughout the conference itself. But it makes perhaps more sense for me to narrow down the main focus to the process of the very flow of ideas as they travel and change, and on individuals and groups involved in this process in general. That is, individuals and groups understood only as playing certain types of roles in a story that can be reconstructed. And hopefully this statement helps us manage our expectations as we carry on with the conversation here, and hopefully the usefulness of this way of framing things will be clear by the time we get to the end. Going back to our title, How Ideas Travel and Change, we are looking at the topic of the historical growth and transformation of New Calvinism, particularly in the 20th century. And for the reasons I have just explained, I mean to zoom in on the issue of how to interpret the process through which New Calvinist tradition of thought has flowed from one context to another by taking into account several roles that can be played in general by individuals and groups in the process. So let's turn now to the first tool that I hope will be useful to you as you think through the issue of the intellectual development and transformation of New Calvinism beyond its original context. And that tool is the suggestion of a travelogue, or the story of a trip, a journey, a travel adventure, as an overarching narrative that will help us account for this issue. Now, New Calvinism as a traveling tradition of thought is not an original insight. We are all aware, for instance, of the fact that the founding figures of New Calvinism traveled to America to expound their ideas in this country and the impact generated by that. The biographers of Kuyper and Bavinck, of whom we have at least one here, have described the twofold impact of their respective visits to the United States. You can, for example, read Warfield's introduction to Kuyper to the American audience, published when the Dutch theologian delivered his stone lectures at the close of the 19th century, to have a glimpse of the magnitude of Kuyper's visit. But the impact of a traveling New Calvinism is twofold. For the other side, I'm reminded of how Bavinck reflected on racial tensions after visiting America, and how he described some of the historical and cultural baggage here. And that perhaps had an impact as he went back to the Netherlands for further writing and reflection. So it's no news to you, I suspect, that Neocalvinism has been from the beginning a traveling tradition of thought. What's perhaps less obvious is that we can extract some reflection from this historical reality by coming up with an account along the lines of a travel narrative. In the new state of affairs provoked by the ongoing pandemic, travel has perhaps become less familiar to us. And this works to our advantage at the moment, because we can perhaps avoid taking it for granted as we list some of the basic elements involved in a travel episode for the purposes of analysis. As I said, the first obvious element here is that these ideas are generated, circulated, and modified by people, and that's one of the basic assumptions. Another one is that if these ideas are circulating, we assume that they are crossing certain boundaries. They are being transported from the realm in which and for which they were originally conceived into something new. And very often the new host environment requires some adaptation. And in the particular case of people circulating ideas beyond their original environment, one of the most fundamental shifts that happens is a shift from one conversation to another. And this happens regardless of whether the ideas are being transported from their original field of practice, say philosophy or politics or theology, or whether they're being exported to another country or culture. Either way, we should not be surprised when we see people bringing Neocalvinism into a different context and having to adapt, rephrase, translate, and perhaps dilute or even modify it in order to make it work in this new environment. And the temptation as we look at what happens, and I say that from what I've seen in print, the temptation is to restrict our discussion to the issue of policing, whether such and such contemporary author has misapplied or misinterpreted some aspect of the new Calvinist canon while importing it to another conversation. And when we do this, we overlook the productive ways in which the new Calvinist tradition has been kept alive and grown through adaptation and reformulation. In my view, it can be more helpful as we look at the history of the tradition of thought to distinguish the issue of embracing or rejecting the results of adaptation and reformulation from the issue of identifying what changes have happened and still happen as the ideas circulate across disciplines and across different cultural environments. Another element in this story that we perhaps take for granted is the arrival of the ideas after they travel, the arrival at a new context. It's another part of the story that we often overlook, and as a result, we tend not to be sufficiently prepared to study the reception of New Calvinism in our own context from an outsider's perspective. And we end up finding it surprising, perhaps, that the arrival of that tradition in novel contexts often happen in unexpected, if not awkward and contrived ways. Just to give an example, Steve Bishop wrote a doctoral dissertation at Potchefstroom on the reception of New Calvinism in the United Kingdom as a case study. And that shows that groups of Christians, which we often label as dualistic or pietistic and generally uninterested in the engagement with culture as a background, have played indeed an important role historically in importing the New Calvinist tradition to their context. But if you read his dissertation, you'll notice something else. You'll see that the arrival of the ideas in the UK was not a simple transportation from origin to destination, like we do with luggage when we travel. It was more like importing a consumer good, which has to be negotiated with the authorities, and as it were advertised and sold to the people who populate the new market. that you aspire to enter with your merchandise. Now, I've spent some time with these three assumptions in the travel analogy, that it's people who take away and bring in the ideas, that the tradition travels across boundaries, whether in thought or actually in location, and that their arrival at a novel context is contrived or negotiated sometimes. Now I'd like to help you add more elements to the travel narrative by looking at two sides of travel episodes in more detail. And the first one, focused on the characters of the story, is our next point. And after that, I'll say a few things about the practices that add some motion to the plot of the narrative. So moving on to the second point. The first side of the narrative that I'd like us to develop a bit further is the side of the types of people involved in a travel story like the one we're trying to reconstruct. One thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about roles played by characters in the story in an ideal or typical sense, despite the concrete examples. I, for example, find myself wearing many hats, often at the same time, which is probably not healthy from a sphere sovereignty perspective. And perhaps you'll identify with more than one of these roles as you look at your own practices. And this is good. We're not aiming for precise categorization, but parsing out these roles and idealized characters remains a useful exercise. So let me start from the most prominent types and then consider some roles that are less clear to us at the moment. And the first type of character that I want to mention is that of the ambassador. The ambassador's typical mission is to establish some fundamental level of representation and communication. The first examples to come to mind are obviously those of Kuyper and Bavinck themselves and their travels to America, where they were given a platform to deliver the main points of their message, the ones they thought were the most important elements of their thought. Dooyeweerd is also a known example, and here's an account of his travels to America by historian C.T. McIntyre in a 1985 book on the history of Reformed theology in the US and Canada. McIntyre says, quote, "Immediately after the publication of his work, The New Critique of Theoretical Thought, he traveled twice to North America, once in the fall of 1958 and again in the spring of 1959. The 1959 visit included a lecture tour of several universities and colleges, beginning with Harvard, as well as some public lectures for general audiences. The result was the book based on his lectures, In the Twilight of Western Thought of 1960, written in English. Twilight is probably Dooyeweerd's best introduction to his own thought, and I find that very significant." Then McIntyre goes on to say how Dooyeweerd also met with people to help them get organized and put some principles on paper for what later became the Institute for Christian Studies. So this element stands out here, not only with Dooyeweerd, but also with Kuyper and Bavinck. The requirement to distill some of their key ideas to a new audience has led them to write books that later became important points of entry into the New Calvinist tradition. Anyone who comes to me for introductory advice on New Calvinism will get a short reading list that includes Philosophy of Revelation, Kuyper's Stone Lectures, and Dooyeweerd's Twilight. We see here the ambassadors opening up a channel of communication and using it to transmit the essentials of the message of the New Calvinist tradition to a new environment. Conversely, the receiving end in the story also sent their own people abroad, much like the role perhaps of a merchant, and that's the second role, in the old days of navigation, who would go abroad to find something valuable, spices, shiny metals, and bring those things back to add some precious goods to the national wealth. We can add color to this picture by thinking of entire generations of scholars trained in Europe who later went back to their countries of origin and had a significant impact in promoting the tradition there, whether in Canada, the US, South Africa, and at a later stage, the UK, Mexico, and some other places. Now, I'm using the label merchant for this, and many of you may be thinking of some of the pathologies of mercantilism, as we know from history. But notice that I've described this role in terms of being entrepreneurial, of finding something valuable and bringing it to a new audience in a pioneering way. I'm using this label to emphasize agency. But we can also pause and think briefly about the pathologies that frequently come to mind when we think about the old days of mercantilism and navigation across the oceans, and more specifically of colonialism and the peculiar flow of cultural exchange that results from an asymmetrical relationship. And I hope to come back to some of these points later, but for now, you can sort of understand another side of the reality of a traveling tradition of thought, which is that people on the receiving end are often depicted as not having much agency because we think of them as merely absorbing ideas instead of actively and creatively engaging with them. We often look at the master and apprentice model as a pattern to understand Neocalvinism. We normally tell the story of who influenced whom in a linear and unidirectional way, instead of looking at the creative ways in which these merchants went abroad and learned, selected, filtered, modified, adapted, and remarketed the tradition when they returned home. This is not to say that they had a lot of power and freedom, but rather that we should allow for more agency on their part as we tell the story of this traveling idea. As we look, for instance, at the reality of graduate students from East Asia, Africa, or Latin America coming to Europe or North America to study and then returning home with new ideas and new qualifications to have a significant impact there when they return. Moving on from ambassadors and merchants, another character of interest is the translator. We can think about this type in a very literal way, someone who gets Bafink to speak Korean, or someone who gets David Koizes to speak Portuguese, though David himself speaks it rather fluently. But very often the translator builds another kind of language bridge. The translator is also someone who makes Vollenhoven's philosophical methodology accessible to undergraduate students, much like Professor Benny van der Walt has done throughout his career in South Africa. And you'll probably agree with me that translators are also very active in their jobs and in many ways end up reformulating some of the points. Thus, for example, you may want to understand Roy Clauser's Myth of Religious Neutrality or Danny Strauss' Philosophy, Discipline of Disciplines, not only as publications that make New Calvinist philosophy intelligible, but also as expansions of New Calvinism through in-depth reformulation, illustration, and advancement of several issues in critical dialogue with Dooyeweerd and others in our tradition. Those are still very advanced readings, but there are examples of bridges that are built from academic jargon to everyday language, accessible to non-specialists. And Dr. Albert Walter's Creation Regained is, to me, a successful bridge as an example. There are those, however, who will focus not only on intelligibility as translators, but also on marketability as intermediaries. They themselves are bridges. This leads me to the next figure that has to be mentioned, the second-hand trader. Now, with reference to the flow of ideas, this term has been used pejoratively by the likes of F.A. Hayek, who distrusted public intellectuals. But I, to the contrary, think the second-hand trader, public intellectuals being just an example of that, but also Christian school teachers, college professors, preachers, and so on, the second-hand trader plays a fundamentally constructive role in transmitting the tradition and making it attractive to newcomers and to the next generation. And again, we need to emphasize the agency and the intellectual labor of this type of character. The second-hand trader thinks things through first and then repackages them to make them more suitable to the new context. a lot of the work that Evan Runner did ran along those lines. And without Evan Runner, that wouldn't probably have been much organized Neo-Calvinism in higher education today. I mention Runner's example also because nobody doubts his competence and proficiency in the most complex Neo-Calvinist ideas of his day, and nobody doubts that he undertook a lot of intellectual and also practical labor to make Neo-Calvinism reach the generation after him. Let's not forget the second-hand traders' networking abilities as well. On this, I'll give you an example that's perhaps not very well known. There's a tradition there is a new trend in Brazil among ministers who are PhD students in the New Calvinist tradition to develop a second-hand trading operation alongside their own original research in the tradition. They set up mentoring programs where they go through reading lists and different topics covering theology, philosophy, and culture with their mentees. One project called the Invisible College curates readings in translation, video lectures, podcasts, and other types of free resources available online. You can either go through the list on your own, or you can go through an Oxford-style one-on-one discussion with the tutor, where you talk about the readings and react to them by writing essays and refining your ideas. This is not just second-hand trading, but also a way of weaving a new Calvinist network bottom-up. Following the idea of a travel story and speaking of networking, which is often important in any business trip, let's not forget the important work done by the groups involved in the Buffing Conference and the Kuyper Conference, as well as the Association for Christian Philosophy events in the Netherlands in this regard. But more specifically, with the second-hand trading component, it's well known that Francis Schaeffer and the Labrie Fellowship have played historically a key role in the engagement with the topic of Christianity and culture from the early days. And today, at least the British Labrie branch, but also the Brazilian one, playing important roles in the promotion of Neo-Calvinism. Schaeffer's books are themselves clearly influenced by the notion of dialogue and antithesis, and a positive view of Christian intellectual labor integrated with everyday work and meaningful friendships and relationships. You can even argue that Schaeffer wasn't only transmitting the New Calvinist view of things, but also creatively adapting it to a new language and to American evangelicalism in particular, to a broader audience. Some of you would place Schaeffer perhaps outside the tradition of thought because of the loose connection with it. And here we find perhaps a borderline case of what is another possible character in the type of story we're thinking about. And that is the figure of the fellow traveler. It's no secret that New Calvinism influenced many figures in American evangelicalism, but their work and ideas, while advancing the general direction and outline of New Calvinist thought, also contain some specific turns and adaptations that have caused many to place them outside the tradition as such. I consider presuppositional apologetics in the Van Til approach a byproduct of a fellow traveler. And it was through Van Til, for example, that I have come to know Dooyeweerd's ideas by reading the footnotes. And probably it's the case of many others here. And I think it's fair to say that there is an important and productive shift of focus in presuppositionalism, for example, by placing epistemology before ontology, which is rather strange to Neo-Calvinist thought. So at least from our side, the presuppositionalists are normally seen as fellow travelers with whom we share many things, not least the overall bid to reform scholarship from a biblical perspective and the denial of neutrality in the deeper layers of thought that give us direction to our intellectual and practical tasks. I'm afraid I do need to move on to the next part, but not without briefly mentioning some additional roles that, for better or for worse, have also shaped the way ideas travel in any field. If you travel bringing something valuable, you often have to meet a customs officer. I often find this role played also by non-public intellectuals who are leading figures in certain conversations. When a book comes out, they can give the endorsement, but if they give a negative review, that's basically the end of the potential impact of that book. And that effect is multiplied when you're trying to import an idea to a completely different conversation. The customs officer plays a general role of a gatekeeper, and so do peer reviewers as well as sponsors who decide on whether to fund a particular project or not. And this is just reality, and it's how it happens. I said that I meant to fill in our travel narrative with two things. The first one we tackled just now, imagining some of the important characters in our story, almost as playing the role of ideal types in our account. But if this is a story, we only have characters and the general idea that the plot involves travel. So now it's time to look at some of the actions in the plot line. Practices and possible plots. Having explored the idea of accounting for Neocalvinism as a traveling tradition of thought and the typology of people involved in this dynamics, I turn now to the third point, the practices connected to this traveling flow of ideas. Some of this has been mentioned in passing as we dealt with the different roles that individuals and groups can play in our travel story. But there's more to say when we turn our attention to the things that different people can do in practice. The general point here is that all the practices I'm going to mention can be placed on a range between replication on one side and originality on the other in terms of their engagement with Neocalvinism whenever the transmission of the tradition is at stake. Or, if we focus on the reception instead, the continuum will be between embracing the tradition and fighting against it altogether. And that's homework for those interested in developing this, is to do a matrix where you have the 2x2 laid out. The general point here is that, so there are three sets of practices that I would like to list. They are practices related to interpretation, border crossing itself, and adaptation. As part of the first set, we find practices that pertain to the interpretation of ideas as they travel from one conversation to another. Much of what we consider to be the Neo-Calvinist tradition is embodied in printed text. So the initial item of this set of practices has to do with reading, or misreading sometimes. And for that, we need publication. And as the ideas travel, we also need translation of the material. We talk about the role of translators, and this is translation. All of that comes with a cost of time, energy, and money, of course. Just think about it. There's no chance at all that anything like the Abraham Kuyper translation project could have happened on the same level of organization professionalism in a setting such as the one where I am used to working. So this costs a lot of time, money, and it turns into a career pathway for a whole group of people, particularly in translation and publication. A few other practices, such as pre-approval, can play an important role that is often overlooked. There are trade-offs in life, and as a result, even with the internet and open source publications, digital tools, not everything will get translated or published. And to give an example of this pre-approval practice, there was a choice back in the day not to translate certain parts of Kuyper's Renewal and Reflection, a set of newspaper articles, particularly the part where he deploys a critique of market regulation and economic planning based on his view on the practical effects of reductionism. As those translations were first circulated in North America, a professor who was at the time very strategic in the development of Reformational philosophy was writing very positively about Marxism and implying that the churches should take a second look at Marxist cry for social justice. It may be a coincidence that some of the more market-friendly views of the earlier Neo-Calvinists have only come to light to English speakers over the last decade or so, but a choice was made back in the day when the first translations were published. And my point is actually that there doesn't have to be a clear intentionality behind this pre-approval practice. This selectivity happens naturally because some choices have to be made. And these choices may reflect a clear agenda or a perception of what's the right momentum to publish certain things, or they may not. Plus, we should refrain from judging this filtering pre-approval practice in the interest of noticing how, regardless of having good or bad consequences, it does lead to something productive, meaning as it travels, the traditional thought will simply not remain the same. And maybe some corners of it will arrive at the new context, and that will lead to a reinterpretation, a re-signification of those parts that arrived at the new context. The second set of practices relate to border crossing. I mentioned pre-approval having the idea of visa paperwork in mind, if we keep going with the travel analogy. With no visa, there's no travel. With no pre-approval, there's no publication of certain ideas in a new context. As for border crossing, I think we all get the general sense by now, but just to prevent any misinterpretation here, I'm just reminding you that it doesn't have to be national border crossing, and very often it isn't, in the world of traveling ideas. We can have social border crossing, for instance, as the general Neocalvinist way of looking at the world goes beyond the confines of a college or the Christian school and ends up being a much broader and inclusive conversation cutting across social class, professions, age groups, and of course cultural groups. I once found myself discussing sphere sovereignty with teenagers in a town on the edge of the Amazon River where people were fishing from the flooded streets after a storm. Now, these are not college-attending wealthy people. And they were very enthusiastic about the doctrines of grace, but they wanted to learn from historical examples how to make the Christian faith real in everyday life. You get the point of social border crossing. Border crossing can be from place to place. It can be social, cultural. It can also be cross-disciplinary. And a great example, I think, is how Calvin Searfeld adapted Vollenhoven's method to understand the history of Western art. And another example is how Andrew Basden has used Doivred's philosophy to understand information systems and technology. Besides interpretation and border crossing, we find a third set of practices, and this time related to adaptation. Recontextualization is one common practice under this rubric. This often goes together with resignification. One example that has struck me over the years is how Kuyper's notion of sphere sovereignty and Doivred's view of the pistic aspect have been adapted by natural scientists, some natural scientists, to mean that the Christian view of science is to do science normally done by everybody else, since it has its own place, and that we don't really need the Christian or reformational natural science after all. Even more interestingly, some of those who disagree with this view end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater when they warn us of the dangers of Neocalvinism because it allegedly defends a secularist kind of science, because faith is restricted to the pistic aspect of creation. Now, it's perhaps unfair to dwell on this illustration because I'm not sure these arguments were made in print. And again, let's refrain from assessing those claims for now, but it's clear that they probably don't reflect the original Neocalvinist view, and that therefore in the reception of the Neocalvinist tradition, by Christians concerned with natural science, the initial view has been adapted to new conversations. That in itself we need to analyze when we write the travelogue of Neocalvinism, is my point. Or more polemically, another adaptation that comes to mind is the historical use of Neocalvinism to justify the so-called policy of separate cultural development, which later became the policy of apartheid in South Africa. There's an entire literature denouncing Neocalvinist writers, past and present, of supporting the sort of distorted worldview that culminated in that harmful and disastrous policy. And there's an entire secondary literature showing how, despite Kuyper in particular subscribing to racist views on race, the New Calvinist view of the limited role of the state and a pluralistic society, in fact, undermines the worldview behind the apartheid regime. And therefore, if we're indeed aware that when ideas travel, they also change, we might find a third way of dealing with this issue while at the same time engaging in more self-critical exercise wherever that's necessary. There are other practices still under this label of adaptation. Expansion is an important one. So certain sides of New Calvinism, the New Calvinist movement expanding to other fields of study and everyday practice. So you can think of Elaine Botta's pioneering work on the philosophy of language and linguistics. Another important practice being that of close dialogue with the new conversation, where New Calvinism arrives in a new context. So the work of Lambert Zijldewaard or Nicholas Wolterstorff, each of them separately and differently putting New Calvinism in conversation with critical theory. Or James K.A. Smith indicating points of tension and points of dialogue with postmodernism. And there's another practice that we don't think very often about, which is hybridization. And there's a particularly neglected kind of hybridization that is the one theorized by some post-colonial critics when they discuss the power asymmetry between colonizer and the colonized, and point out that the colonized also have agency in their production of literature, arts, and so on. And they hybridize by by trying to make it more acceptable to the dominant elite culture. And they need some kind of disguise, even camouflage, in order to perhaps even subvert the dominant culture. Well, when New Calvinism travels to a different conversation where people look up to the mainstream academic environment, perhaps, whether in the same country or abroad, it may need some kind of camouflage in order to be accepted. So we may miss a fellow traveler who is probably trying to make a more nuanced point about certain things by dismissing that person's ideas as being synthetic, perhaps, or outside the tradition, when in fact it is the camouflage that's going to ensure that the tradition remains alive in the new context. And I suspect that outside of a Christian college, many of us have to be extra careful with how we present our research. Now imagine how non-academic New Calvinists articulate their practices and thinking in a country where Christianity is often targeted for persecution. In this case, what would be surprising is if the traditional thought had been placed in a new context with no adaptation whatsoever. To sum up then, I began by suggesting how the idea of travel can help account for the dynamic development of the New Calvinist tradition. After that, we looked together at some of the types of characters that could be involved in a travel story like that. Now I have just talked about some practices that add dynamics to the plot of the story. It's time to conclude by asking some of the so what questions. What is the added value of doing this? And we can even talk more about that later on. But very briefly, I think the first advantage of looking at New Calvinism not as disembodied concepts and theories, but rather as people on the move exchanging ideas, is that we end up with a more multi-aspectual narrative, to use a terminology that you're familiar with. A second advantage, derived from the first one, is that we don't need to assume that this tradition of thought is fixed. We don't need to come up with a list of the core immutable elements of New Calvinist thinking and then assess each contemporary author in our circles based on how close they are to that immutable, idealized New Calvinism. Or at least we can feel free to postpone that assessment or suspend it, take a step back and merely note that ideas are changing as they travel and the movement grows, and note that this leads to new productive thinking. Innovation, by the way, has often resulted in the history of ideas from misinterpretation, misapplication, or reinterpretation. We shouldn't be surprised to find this sort of dynamics in our circles either. And that story needs to be told with accuracy. Third advantage is that this opens our eyes to realize the creative adaptation that takes place as New Calvinism is imported, for example, into the majority world or into new fields of thought and practice. A fourth advantage is that the notion of a travel narrative can help us begin to address some of the questions informally asked but seldom addressed and very often dismissed, such as, why are so many enthusiasts of Reformational thought today not Reformed? Why are so many New Calvinists not Calvinists? Why are so many historically Reformed church groups that have embraced New Calvinism not necessarily consistent with it in belief or practice? What if I like scholasticism and natural law? Is there a place for me in New Calvinism? Why do New Calvinists disagree internally, not only in terms of specific applications of their thought, but very often at the very bottom layer of their ideas? Why is it that New Calvinist thought has been instrumentalized to defend both freedom and oppression in different contexts? And perhaps a final advantage is that this sort of approach has the potential to assist us in brushing aside the very annoying question, what makes a true New Calvinist? Who is in and who is out? Hopefully, the things I've mentioned this evening can add something to the conversations taking place this week and in the near future. Hopefully, some of you will want to take this view further as you write your intellectual biographies, teach your classes, and mentor your friends. We have an interest in New Calvinism because we believe it will help us to be good stewards of God's gifts as we pursue our tasks in God's world. Thank you again and enjoy your conference.
So we did get started a little later, so we've got some time for questions and discussion. And kids these days, I think they say, "I feel seen." Lucas was looking at me, I think, just briefly when he was talking about scholasticism and natural law. So, can I take the mic to people? That's fine. Okay, maybe that's a better way to do it if I can get it out. So raise your hand. I'll bring it to you.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for that lecture. I love any kind of extended metaphor, so it really helped me categorize all these sorts of things. But I do struggle a little bit, as much as I am sympathetic to the idea, that infighting can be a little pedantic or whatever. You gotta have some boundaries, right? There's gotta be some, Neo-Calvinism has to be something. People who sell goods, to extend your metaphor, if you say, hey, would you like some Pepsi, and they give you Coke instead, maybe a lot of people wouldn't notice, but some people might be very upset. So I guess I want to push back a little bit on that concluding statement, while, again, being sympathetic. I would wonder, okay, well, what makes many of the people here Neo-Calvinists as opposed to not, and despite all these disagreements and differences.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Dylan. Good to see you again. I think the answer is more or less analogous to linguistics. What makes English English? As opposed to Old English or whatever will come next, right? And the focus here was on the motion, and you. I think your remark comes as a warning. We should not just focus on the dynamics of it, but there are certain things that there's change and there's order, right? You'll find. If you look online, you'll find lots of people trying to define the hardcore of New Calvinism, but some of those items that are listed, I'm not sure about. Like common grace, for example. It's no secret that Schilder wasn't very happy with the idea of common grace, but would you say he was no New Calvinist? I'm not sure. I mean, you know, it depends on how you have to, whoever is telling this story, if they do that in publication, they'll have to be, perhaps not put a straight jacket on it, but they'll have to say, okay, there are some basic ideas that all these people agreed on, but even those actually got reinterpreted over time. And I think one author that might help make sense of this dynamic aspect of any tradition of thought is Mark Bevere, and he wrote an article called On Traditions, and it's very easy to find it online. Mark Bevere, B-E-V-I-R. And he's in dialogue with Quentin Skinner, it might ring a bell as a name. And the focus is really, you know, he's not saying toss everything and all the permanence, but if you're doing history, you also need to account for change. And it was more or less, you know, trying to move the focus to an account of change, I think, is the main purpose here. Yeah. I mean, I could list, you know, the Neocalvinists believe in A, B, C, but you can find articles on that. I'm not sure if the things I've seen actually delimit it in a way that also does historical justice to what has happened over time in the movement that we still call New Calvinist, right? And a New Calvinist today looks very different in his or her beliefs, practices, and cultural look on things than Kuyper, for example, or Bavinck, right? So we have to explain that somehow, right? Yeah.
Lucas, thank you for a stellar lecture. I thought that was just so hugely impressive and helpful. I think that the traveling metaphor is a very thought-provoking one, and I'll be chewing over it for a while. I use a different metaphor when I'm trying to describe the same thing, the same set of questions within Neocalvinism. And it's a metaphor derived from linguistics. And so when Dylan asked you that question, you moved from travel to linguistics, and you're obviously quite a polyglot. So I'm very curious to know how useful you think my metaphor is. And it's the metaphor of a dialect continuum, where the form of speech from one village to the next is highly mutually intelligible, but not identical. But then if the villages in the continuum are 100 miles apart, then you have a different a lower degree of mutual intelligibility. And then if you're on the extremes of the continuum, then you might be talking about Frisian as opposed to Swiss German, or something like that. Or you could really stretch it out and end up in Iceland with Icelandic as opposed to Swiss German. It's not quite a dialect continuum, but they're all variations of Germanic speech. And you can see looking on them that they all have something in common. They all belong to each other. And the placings on the continuum account for similarities, but also differences. But you know, if you have a footing somewhere in the continuum, let's say you speak Dutch, then you can make a lot of sense of German, High German, let's say. Swiss German, maybe less so in some forms. And I think that has a lot of potential for explaining the same kind of thing. I'm not setting up as a rival one. I'm just curious to know what you think of it. And, you know, in searching for metaphors, we're always trying to explain things well. Yeah, what do you think of the dialect continuum metaphor?
No, I agree with you. I think it's a very helpful analogy. And, you know, I think I mentioned it too in the first question. I think, you know, it is the same problem as defining what makes the English language, right, as opposed to Latin, Old English, or French, right? And I think that's very helpful, especially coming from your mouth, because I'm about to mention this idea of spontaneous order and the fact that we have something analogous to that in language and in a tradition of thought. So there's no central planner telling people, you know, you need to think these ideas to be a good New Calvinist, right? There's no mastermind of New Calvinism, right? These things emerge organically, right? And you know, obviously, you know, the Scottish Enlightenment was big on this idea of spontaneous order, Adam Ferguson, and so on. So I do think, you know, linguistics is a very helpful way of looking at it, and they have had to face similar problems of constancy and change, right? And that's also a theme in Reformationist historiography, which actually we should go back to if we want to tell the tell any story that tries to account for the history of Neocalvinism, right? So it's not only just a multi-aspectual view of the tradition of thought, but also a multi-aspectual view of history, I think, would be required if we want to be consistent with our own beliefs about, what would make sound scholarship within this tradition. Yeah, thank you. I really think that that's very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. The metaphor has given me a lot to think about. One of the first questions that came to mind for me is, if we're talking about the tradition as a journey or an adventure, what's the destination? Where is it going? Or is it a destination, or would a direction be a better way to frame it? And if so, does that help us with the boundaries question? Like if it's a direction and something's going in a completely different direction, that might help us determine what's within the tradition and what's without. Just wondering if you have thoughts on that when you came up with this metaphor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if the ideas are traveling, they are going from one place to another. I don't know if it was the original intention of going beyond the Netherlands, but maybe it was, because there was some claim to universality and things being grounded in the creation order. So I think there's nothing initially that would say that Neo-Calvinism expanding around the globe or across disciplines is wrong, or it should be just for theology or just for. So that's one thing. But you also, the language you use is reminding me of the entire discussion of structure and direction, right? So as a traditional thought, it has a structure and it has a direction, pretty much like everything else. And we do have to pause and ask ourselves sometimes, what is the direction that this endeavor is taking? Neo-Calvinism has been misused. It still is. And you can think of concrete examples, and I think I touched on some of those. And you can say, that wasn't true Neo-Calvinism, but you can frame that in terms of the ideas were not right or they were misinterpreted. But you can also frame in terms of directionality. They were not used for God's glory and for our neighbors, for loving our neighbors. Quite the contrary, they were used to harm people and to bring glory to ourselves or our own project or whatever. So I think it's also an individual question, right? Within ourselves, in our own hearts, we also have the antithesis there, right? So I think this all leads to think about direction as well, which wasn't really what I was thinking about when I wrote this. But yeah, we do, as we reflect on the past and future of Neo-Calvinism, I think that's an important question. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucas, very much. That was breathtaking. I was expecting the next caricature, and the feature of your lecture was really good. You make me proud of my Brazilian roots every time I hear you.
Okay, I'm getting embarrassed now.
The question I have is, what is the place or the role for social media in the travel of the ideas? Because now, as Brazilians, we know we like social media a lot, and we are doing a lot of social media in our own country. And I would say that's one of the major venues for Neo-Calvinist tradition to flow into our country. What are your thoughts on social media and the role of social media in getting these ideas further and further in different nations?
Yeah, that's not really my thing. I have not many followers on Twitter. But I think, I know what you're talking about. The recent conference at the Food that was online, so very cheap to watch, had a few hundred Brazilians, right? I think they basically took over. Someone plotted a pizza chart, and I think more than half of them were Brazilians. And that the link was shared on Facebook in a Doivert Brazil group, right? So there is social media, but there are also people who are very influential, and they are I don't know what name I gave them in one of those characters, but they are the people who give the endorsement, right? They sponsor the idea, they're really on board with it, and people who look up to them, they'll And I think that's the case in Brazil specifically, but maybe in other countries as well, in other contexts. If this guy likes it, it must be a good material, good content, so I'm going to follow this, even if they're not, fully aware of what it is. I think someone mentioned this morning about buffing, that people liked the ideas, but they had never heard of the name. And so, I mean, there has been I think the social media discussion is important. We have to remember that Kuyper and pretty much everybody, they were all involved in journalism, right? And in a different register, different language that they were using to reach other types of audiences. They were not just at the university as tenured professors and doing their own niche thing. So that was built into the tradition that has always been this idea of reaching out to different types of audiences, and even the next generation, training the children to think in a certain way and so on as they grow up. Yeah.
Lucas, thank you for a really learned and thought-provoking paper. I just wanted to ask about some metaphors, travel metaphors, that I wonder which weren't there, which you might want to comment on. What about if I suggested invader, colonizer, or military chaplain? They also travel. They also take ideas across borders. Would you be comfortable incorporating them into your scheme? Would they add anything to your scheme, do you think? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's this entire discussion of Kuyper saying that the colonies should be Christianized, and that would be a good thing for them, right? Even though eventually they should become independent as well, right? And that has happened in the past. I don't think it's happening. I think it's hard to come up with any examples of Neocalvinism being imposed top down today, except if maybe you come do your PhD here and someone tells you must be, you must believe in common grace in your dissertation. But maybe, I mean, there has been an article recently about, so apparently there are evangelicals in Brazilian politics who use this language of sphere sovereignty and antithesis and so on, who are reaching prominent positions. And someone has picked up on that and written an expose. It doesn't matter that it's not a particularly well-argued piece, but what matters is that there is a perception now that this is invading public life, that there should be no religion in public life. That's the pushback against it. And these new Calvinists or whatever they are, we don't even know what they are, but they are taking over the federal government and pushing their agenda now top down. So this is the level of the conversation that's happening now about religion, and specifically evangelicals in politics in Brazil. And I think maybe in other countries, as the movement grows and some people reach prominent positions, that it might be the case as well. That would be the closer to some kind of complaint against certain attempts at domination, perhaps from the New Calvinist worldview. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Freire, for your intriguing presentation. You mentioned the role of characters in the narrative, and I was wondering, with the rise of interest in spatial theories in philosophy and also in theology, I'm thinking of people like Dr. Willie Jennings of spatial imagination. How do the role of space play out in the narrative? Is it an agency on its own, or does it kind of shape agency?
Well, okay, I'm trying to be a good Doiverdian. Is it on the subject side or the object side? Yeah, space is one of the aspects through which everything exists, right? So, I mean, you can use a spatial analogy like I've been trying to do here. I'm not sure I want to philosophize too much, but it permeates this account, and I think it doesn't permeate sufficiently other accounts of how the ideas travel and change over time, yeah. So I think, I'm not going to say space is a thing. Space is a way in which things exist, and it permeates the way things, including an assemblage of ideas, a tradition of thought, a movement, and so on. Yeah.
Well, with that, the time of our institutional, formal program together is done. I hope there's some time for some more spontaneous and organic conversations, not only this evening, but throughout the rest of the conference. The institutional will resume tomorrow morning, according to the schedules. But join me in thanking Lucas for this wonderful talk.
Thank you again.